Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, High Performers versus High Potentials, Creating an Inclusive Talent Pipeline. My name is Sabina Michael, and I am the Associate Director of the Intercultural Skills Lab at the Rotman School of Management. I'm delighted to partner with the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, led by Ryerson's Diversity Institute, and co-host this event with Dr. Wendy Sukier. Also joining us today are our panelists, Marianne Mendes, Nadine Spencer, and Lisa Sohan-Pal. We have attendees from across Canada and the US, and it's wonderful that so many of you could join us, especially at a time when we have so many questions about the future and how we can continue to be mindful and inclusive. Thank you for being here. Before I hand over to Wendy, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about what we do at the Intercultural Skills Lab, or ISL. Diversity is a big component of Canada's national identity. And at ISL, we believe that to ensure that diversity pays dividends, true integration requires inclusive practices that focus on cognitive diversity or diversity of thought, and not just on demographic D&I. Our goal is to deepen cultural understanding and support you to nurture culturally fluent teams where diverse people feel they belong because they are valued and respected, have access to opportunities and resources, and can contribute their perspectives and talents to build their organizations. We support organizations and individuals to build intercultural fluency through education, dialogue, and partnerships. Today's webinar will start with a presentation by Wendy, followed by a panel discussion. We will take questions throughout the presentation from the audience, so please submit them using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can live. I'd now like to introduce and welcome Dr. Wendy Sukier. Dr. Sukier is a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy and founder of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University. She's the co-author of the bestseller, Innovation Nation, Canadian Leadership from Java to Jurassic, and the former VP of Research and Innovation. The Diversity Institute at Ryerson focuses on dimensions of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, future skills, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Harnessing the power of innovation, it promotes the advancement of underrepresented groups. We're delighted to have you with us here today to share your insights and moderate our panel. Over to you, Wendy.
I'm learning new tricks. I should also add that I'm a Rotman grad.
Yes.
So today I just want to take about 10 minutes and review at a high level the background research that informs our panel today. And I know from the extensive list of people who are participating, there are many who are experts, but we want to level set with an overview of the business case, review of where we are, an explanation of what we mean by the difference between high performers and high potential employees, and a systems approach to change, which we advocate. So when we look at the business case for diversity and inclusion, increasingly it's understood that it's important for addressing the skills shortage, that full labor market growth will come through immigration. We know that as markets become more diverse and as companies are becoming more global, it's an advantage to have diverse workforces. We know that there is a link between how well organizations address issues around diversity and inclusion, as well, and the engagement and performance of their employees, as well as their satisfaction. There's also a lot of research that tells us that diversity and inclusion drives innovation. And one of the things we're interested in is how we can harness innovation to drive diversity and inclusion. There's very little doubt now that immigrants drive economic success in a variety of ways. They're overrepresented among entrepreneurs. They're overrepresented among entrepreneurs that export. We know in Silicon Valley, more than half of the entrepreneurs are newcomers. And there are organizations across the country that recognize that harnessing diversity and inclusion is critical. And I'm a particular fan of the Lake Ridge health advertisement that was run at a time when some provinces were focused on excluding newcomers, and particularly those with visible religious symbols. And they turned that around into a competitive advantage with their ad that said, "We don't care what's on your head, we care what's in it." I actually think that should be a slogan for Canada, because that approach will help us attract the best and the brightest. I think everybody's aware of the glass ceiling, of the fact that there are more CEOs named Robert than there are women among the largest companies, and that in spite of women approaching 50% of the workforce, as we move up in organizations, they're underrepresented. We've done research at the Diversity Institute that is particularly instructive, I think, because it looks not just at the underrepresentation of women, which is well studied, but also the underrepresentation of racialized people. And while all racialized people are not immigrants and all immigrants are not racialized people, we do know that Toronto, the GTA now, for example, is 50% newcomer, 50% racialized minorities. So you can see here that in every sector you look at, women are underrepresented, most underrepresented in the corporate sector, but racialized people, who are also 50% of the workforce, are even more underrepresented. And one of the most important findings out of this study was, if you intersect women and racialization, if you look at racialized women, white women outnumber racialized women 17-1 in corporate leadership roles, even though in the GTA, for every white woman, there's a racialized woman. So we know that intersectionality is critically important. The situation in Montreal, as you would expect, is somewhat better for women in leadership, far worse for racialized people. There's extensive evidence of bias in the workplace. Colleagues have done research that shows if you have a foreign sounding last name, you're less likely to get an interview. Rates of unemployment are higher among immigrant women, and so on and so forth. And we've seen lots of research that looks at particular sectors, for example, science, technology, engineering, and math, where women are particularly underrepresented, and where the higher you go, the more you see gender as a barrier. We also see today, amid the COVID crisis, that women, immigrants, racialized people are more at risk, are more affected by economic dislocation, and women, particularly racialized and immigrant women, are more affected by the closure of schools and daycares. They bear the brunt of unpaid labor. I have a graduate student with 2 children who works in her car because her apartment is too small for her to find private space, and so on and so on. And one area we're particularly interested in is the impact of COVID on entrepreneurs. We know that women's businesses are far more affected because they tend to be concentrated in services. They tend to be smaller without employees, and more women are self-employed than are owners of SMEs. So these barriers in the workplace compound layer upon layer when we look at entrepreneurship. Let's turn for a moment to this notion of high performance versus high potential. High-performing employees focus on exceeding expectations but they may focus on their current job rather than long-term opportunities. High potential employees, on the other hand, are often what are looked at for leadership opportunities, and obviously the ideal situation is where you have the intersection of high potential and high performance employees. Managers tend to see high potential leaders as being proactive, being receptive to feedback, knowing the business, and fitting with the culture. Fit is often code for bias. Often fit is code for just like me and tends to exclude both women, newcomers, and others. We know that this bias plays out in performance reviews where the norms are highly gendered. Men are often evaluated based on their potential, whereas women are judged on performance. And there's been lots of research to show that men are presumed to be competent while women have to prove that they're competent over and over and over again. And this is compounded when those women are immigrants or racialized. We all know about the language, the code language. A man is a leader, a woman is bossy. And the confidence gap reinforces some of these assumptions. You can see on the right, this is absolutely true, whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about sports coaches, whether we're talking about management, whether we're talking about full professors at universities. Men will apply for jobs when they have only 60% of the qualifications. Women will apply only if they meet all of the requirements, and often they still have to be encouraged to apply. So this confidence gap is systemic, and certain cultures and traditions reinforce these barriers where the assumption is self-promotion is untoward, or where there's deference to authority. We have to therefore take a systems approach. We have to consider individual issues, organizational issues, and some of the societal stereotypes that present barriers. When we think about managers, we think about men, and most often white men. We focus on STEM, which excludes women. We know that these stereotypes are pervasive. We know that they shape policies and processes. We know that the media reinforces these, so does the socialization of girls. These are big structural issues we have to cope with, and we see it over and over and over. When we look at the organizational level, we have to think about leadership, we have to think about cultures and values. We have to think about measurement and accountability, as well as strong, transparent HR practices. But we have to think about using this lens of diversity and inclusion throughout the value chain, in everything we do, in procurement, in product design, in marketing and service. And then, of course, we have to grapple with these individual factors. And that's why the panel today is so interesting, because in spite of the barriers, we know that some women, some immigrant women, some racialized immigrant women, some Muslim racialized immigrant women succeed in spite of all of these barriers. And there are many different strategies for knocking down the barriers, getting around them, under them, or through them. And we'll hear more about that with our panel today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for setting the stage for our panel discussion. And before we move to the panel, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. And I was hoping we could take at least one of these before we move to the panel discussion itself. One of the questions that's come up is, at a time like this, but even more so, when you are dealing with a crisis, what are some of the tips of things to be mindful of so that you can be more inclusive when you are either evaluating talent or recruiting talent?
I think it's critically important for people in positions of authority to be aware of their privilege and be aware of homophily, which is the tendency to gravitate towards people who are just like you. And often in interview situations, often in recruitment situations, often when we're looking at succession planning, we see that people tend to pick others in their own image. And I think one of the most fundamental things we can all do is be more aware of that and also not be a bystander. Many of us witness situations which are patently unfair, where we see bias and discrimination in the workplace. And if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. I think being a bystander is probably one of the worst things that people can do.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There's one more question. I'm a woman, a new immigrant, and an entrepreneur. I'm working on my business to help new immigrants to have a better platform to start their business in Canada. How do you see the trend of the number of new immigrants coming to Canada after COVID-19? Will the Canadian market be more diversified? Will the Canadian market be more diverse or less diverse?
It's a really good question. And it depends, I think, on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, because in some ways the crisis has brought out the best in Canadians. We've seen, people put their lives at risk, people donate, people spend time trying to help others and so on. But we've also seen a very troubling rise in bias and discrimination, particularly against people from the Far East, from China and Vietnam and so on. And I think it's going to take everything in our power to make sure that we continue to embrace our values around diversity and inclusion. I think with the government that's currently in place, we will prevail, but it's really hard to tell. I wish I could be more optimistic.
Yes, I mean, definitely lots of uncertainty out there. Wendy, if you're ready, shall we move to the panel?
That would be great.
Okay.
So, I'm really pleased to have been included with this wonderful panel today. I'll just quickly introduce. Marianne Mendes is the Managing Director and Head of Client Management at BMO, where she focuses on client analytics within global markets and can certainly talk about how diversity and inclusion is an advantage there. She joined BMO in 2013, was a recipient of the Women in Capital Markets Award. She has a BCom in Business Technology Management, and she's co-chair of the Women in Capital Markets Return to Work program. So welcome, Marianne. The next panelist is Lisa Soha, who's the co-founder and CEO of Nom Nom's World Food. She's the ultimate Epicurean and visionary, holding an MBA, an MSc, and a BSc. She's had over 20 years experience in pharmaceutical and medical devices around the world, again, recognizing the advantages of diversity as a competitive edge. She's won many business awards, including the 2019 TELUS Pitch Multicultural Business of the Year Award and the 2019 Business Woman of the Year. Nadine Spencer is the CEO of Brandy Q Group, Inc., which is a global agency specializing in social change marketing. She is an honors BA from York University, and she has made enormous progress, not just as the CEO of Brandy Q, which serves Fortune 500 companies, but also as the president of the Black Business Professional Association, where she creates opportunities for other entrepreneurs. So welcome all of you. And I guess given our time, I'll direct the questions to one respondent and then others can pitch in. So I guess I'll start with you, Nadine. And maybe you can tell us what you see as some of the challenges immigrant women face in advancing their careers.
Sure. Well, Wendy, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel on this conversation, because I think these dialogues is so critical and important to the work that we do, and in the lives of women as well as and immigrant women. I am an immigrant woman and entrepreneur, so I understand. And so this conversation is very, very important. You know, challenges that women face, you know, immigrant face, I think, you know, three main challenges. One is our visibility as a minority. When I walk into a room, it's very clear that I am an immigrant. I'm a black woman, immigrant woman. Religious differences, you know, coupled with, you know, a cultural gulf in community versus mainstream. And with these challenges, it's, you know, when you talk about, I love it, you know, the fit of which is a bias. We don't fit, you know, which is the presumed bias right away. And I think that's the first challenge. You know, so even though we're skilled, highly skilled individuals, you know, adjusting to our community or any new community can be a struggle, and, you know, requiring much, you know, of a trial and error. And there's also the challenges of stereotypes. You know, who are we in terms of culture? You know, in various situations, you know, someone would say to me, well, you're good at X because, you know, you're, you know, from Jamaica and so forth, when that's not necessarily the truth. And it takes away from the skill set that we bring to the table. It diminishes that. You know, immigrant women in Canada are marginalized a lot in the workplace, you know, overlooked, discriminated against, and pushed to the periphery through exclusions and, you know, sometimes exploitation. And, you know, overall, you know, discrimination dehumanizes people. And a lot of immigrant women, our skills are suppressed in our new environment. And, you know, then we have, you know, certain things like pay equity. And you know, one of the interesting things I find that, you know, we become into this role of being high performing to prove ourselves. And so we don't get into the leadership of the high potential, because we're sort of always compensating for what we need to do to quote unquote fit in, which is a part of that bias that you talk about. So those are some of the challenges that immigrant women face.
Thanks so much, Nadine. I wonder, Marianne, if you wanted to add?
I've been in the capital markets industry for 25 years, and I came to Canada at the age of 21, and just by chance found myself on a trading floor having no idea what the brokerage industry was. So, you know, it was very heavily male dominated, both on the business side and in technology. And it was finding my voice and my confidence and looking at, you know, I have drive, I have passion, I have the ability to learn. What is it that I should be doing? I don't know anybody in Canada, let alone in, you know, at work. So I looked for success stories and I looked at people in different positions, and I found that I had to start taking the initiative to really reach out to understand, what is it that makes you successful? What is it that you've done to achieve what you have? What are the different roles in this organization? And what should I be putting my hand up for? And that's what I ended up doing to really break you know, the status quo. I also came from, you know, quite the hierarchical work environment. So I grew up in Kenya. It was, you know, very respectful, very sort of top down, where, you know, you just did what you were told pretty much. And you didn't challenge status quo. And what I mean by that is more in a respectful way. So, you know, question why you're doing things and what you should really be doing differently. And it took a while to gain that confidence, but it benefited me in, you know, in leaps and bounds. And I think I also looked at, as you said, Wendy, you know, I'm not even at the starting line for the race, right? I don't have the education. I don't have the qualifications. I don't even understand the new environment I'm in. So how do I get to the starting line to begin with, to compete here? And understanding what my own gaps were, both, you know, academically, but also in terms of work experience, helped me really address those gaps. And then I was ready to you know, to start and achieve what I did over time.
I think you raised a really good point, that the cultural differences, the fact that some people are accustomed to valuing deference and respect and so on, whereas North American culture tends to reward people who self-promote far than many other cultures are comfortable doing, and that just amplifies some of the socialization of women. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you distinguish high performers and high potentials. I think that was a really interesting concept that you raised.
So the way I look at it, I mean, essentially they're both the same to a large degree, because they seek to exceed expectations and really become the benchmark in terms of producers. So they gain credibility, they have a good reputation, they become the go-to person in terms of, technical expertise. Where I find the differentiation comes into play is when you're looking to aspire beyond your immediate role and your immediate team, and you look at, the organization holistically. So, I look at BMO, I look at what is the brand, what is the culture, what is the mission and the vision, and what is put in place strategically to achieve that, who are all, what are the different components in that organization, and then how do you go above and beyond from an innovation perspective, from taking more initiative, but also engaging collaboratively across the different domains in the organization to bring about greater good, to bring about not just results in the revenue and the bottom line and service your clients, but also within the organization, how do you develop your employees, right? How do you mentor and coach, but also the sponsorship? So what can you do to tap into your own potential to harness that and bring that forward? So having those broader conversations becomes very critical in then becoming more of that high potential versus high performance individual.
I think it's really interesting, and I think it's true of both women and maybe many newcomers, that the focus is on doing an excellent job rather than thinking ahead to the next step. I was once told by a headhunter that one of my nearly fatal career moves was not realizing that while I was focused on doing an excellent job in my current role, my peers were focused on their next step and planning their careers, and I was too in the weeds to be paying attention to a lot of those political issues that in the end proved to be absolutely critical across sectors for making people successful. So thank you for that. Nadine, back to you again. I wonder if you can talk about steps leaders can take to communicate their vision and also establish themselves as leaders while balancing that delicate, walking that delicate line between being self-promotional versus confident. I don't know, Nadine, can you jump in at this point?
Can you hear me?
Sorry, thanks. Good.
Yes, okay, yes. I mean, the interesting thing here is culturally what we're taught, that self-promotion, I cannot put myself forward, I must put the other person first. And it's always the male as well. It's always the male. And it's learned. My mother would always say, it's part of that politeness. It's all of that politeness, not sort of championing your own skill. And as a leader, so I see this a lot, especially with young women, that sort of will sit at the table and we sort of sit like this. When we walk into the room, it's all how we sort of hold ourselves. When we talk about confidence, it's how do you show up? How do we take up space? And as a leader, when I recognize that that's not happening, we sort of have a conversation. It's the mentorship that's needed and the guidance to say, hey, we collectively can take up space. We have to be present at the table, and it is okay to say what we've done. And some of the times what I notice is that when we say what we've done, we scale it back. We scale it back a lot, and it's looking at two perspectives. It's not either, it's the and. It's recognizing that as immigrant women, there's a style, but it's an and. Like our voices may not be as loud or as strong, but recognizing the and in the silence, in the softer voice, with the ideas at the table and being open. So I think, as leaders, we really have to be cognizant and look and be open to having that when we talk about inclusivity, it's recognizing the different levels of skill set, the different styles, and bringing it out when we see it, and having a space where it's allowed to have your voice and to exude and show your skill set.
Marianne, can you add to this? You've addressed some of it, but I wonder if you can build on it.
I think confidence is a big factor. I found for the longest time, I did not sit at the table. So, when called to meetings, I would sit on the side and not at the table. I found that when I ended up actually showing up for meetings a little bit earlier, so I had the opportunity to introduce myself to people who were already at the meeting preparing to present, for example, and made sure I did have a seat at the table. But I also asked questions, and I think that plays a big part too, because you find out that you're not the only one in the room who doesn't know, right? And it's only when you start asking questions that you begin to find out that there are others in this room that don't know anything either on this topic or on the specific question that is being posed here. So questioning and also putting forth your own opinions and ideas and bringing that to the table adds value. So you need to have a presence. You need to be make sure you're also part of the discussion and the conversation, and also have follow-up ideas. You may not have all the information at the meeting, but nothing is stopping you from contributing post that discussion.
Thanks so much. I wonder, Lisa, we haven't heard much from you. Do you want to jump in here and add your sort of top level recommendations around how leaders can effectively communicate and position themselves? Your microphone's off there. Said the woman whose slides didn't show. Your mic's still off.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, great. Some really great points were raised earlier in this discussion. So I want to just kind of build on that. And what I think that can make a difference is to develop a leadership mindset. Now, that doesn't mean that one needs to become a leader or have aspirations to be a leader. It's just developing that mindset that you come forthright, have a voice at the table, and be confident. And by developing that, it really does help migrant women fast track their success in any organization. It's just that mindset. For example, the challenges of a leadership is to be strong but not rude, be kind but not weak, and be humble but not timid, be proud but not arrogant, have humor but without folly. And there's so many things that we consider as women that men don't. But I think just having that in your mind, that's something that you should focus on, could help tremendously.
How did you develop that mindset?
Yeah, through experience, it was like, for example, I was working in corporate in a large medical device company. I was managing 47 countries around the world and really learning to adapt and do business in various cultures, understanding cultural dynamics, strategy, decision-making, and respect, and how one does operate to have a successful and meaningful negotiation across the 47 countries. And in the corporate environment and in a leadership role, I actually didn't feel that I faced many challenges because I earned my way, really proved myself. And maybe I had to prove myself more than the men, but at that time I was just go, 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 and I knew what I wanted to achieve. And then leaving that corporate environment and starting my own business in an unrelated industry like food, for example. And that was really just came about out of a personal need having 3 kids in 3 years and wanting them to eat healthy, nutritious food from a young age, and providing convenient, packaged meals without any preservatives and additives and all the lovely benefits to really, replace home cooking for the time-conscious consumer. And I remember when I was raising investment and meeting investors. Now, first of all, statistics are, really low for women to even get any investment. Only 2%, actually achieve any kind of investment. And then if you're from a minority background, it's less than 1%. And I just really was in denial because of my achievements throughout the corporate world. I was like, no, I've done everything here to prove that my business deserves investment. And I kind of learned the hard way that actually the first mistake that I made was talking about why I started my business related to my family and having children, so that was the first mistake. I should not even talk about the family or even that I have children, apparently. So that was a big learning, and I was told once, which really hit me in the guts, is that they're not going to give the investment because they don't believe women are capable of running multi-million-dollar businesses. And we're really challenging my numbers, thinking that it's just not achievable, and you're in la la land, especially because you have 3 children and a family to look after as well. So trying to take that out of the equation mentally, was difficult because that was part of my story. It was part of my brand. It's the way I started it. But taking that out was the first step. And then the second thing that I learned very, very quickly is that when investors are speaking to women entrepreneurs, they are always trying to ask you to justify the risk. You're a risky investment, and you've got to sit there and prove that you are not risky, and you're justifying your capabilities and your skills and why your business deserves investment. As opposed to men, they're asking them questions like, what's your vision? How are you building a team? Where do you see the future? And so I learned very quickly that as soon as an investor starts asking those kind of questions, to just get up and walk out, because you've got to realize very, very quickly where the discussion is heading, and it's not going to be favorable because you're going to be in defense mode and they're not listening. So, if you get that kind of indication, just get up and leave and go to someone that really does respect and value where you come from and how you've got to where you are. So it was a tough learning experience.
So interesting, because what you're describing as an entrepreneur is exactly what the research shows, but also it's parallel to that notion that leaders will often recognize potential in male employees, but focus on women's performance and requiring them to demonstrate over and over and over that they can do the job, even the job that they've never had. And I think you're absolutely right that with entrepreneurs, you see the same thing, where venture capitalists will often invest in someone. They make decisions within a couple of minutes, and often they invest in someone because that someone reminds them of themselves when they were young and brash. And so with women, A, they don't remind them of themselves for most cases, and B, they, as you said it very, very well, they focus on the risk. They focus on essentially demonstrating performance when you're just starting out. So I think what both systems point to, in my view, is how deeply embedded bias is and how those layers sort of multiply. I wonder if we can shift.
Wendy, can I just have a quick comment to that point? I love what she had to say. I've been watching Shark Tank recently as part of my Netflix binge watching. And what I noticed is that when the men pitch to the shark, it's very different. They can get an idea put by easily with hardly a business plan. And when the women pitch, we have everything, the numbers and everything, and most of the times they don't get a deal. And then when it's a minority woman, she's dismissed like that. It's really interesting to see, because there you get to visually see what we've experienced all this time.
Absolutely. And one of my pet peeves in the entrepreneurship space is shows like Dragon's Den and Shark Tank have become kind of the standard for incubators, accelerators, assessing merit in startups. It's great theater. It has almost nothing to do with assessing capacity. Those approaches to evaluation reward extroverted, overconfident salespeople as opposed to good ideas very often. So that's thank you for adding that. I think that's a critically important point. I was going to come back to you, Lisa, to ask the question about developing the talent pipeline, and what are the best strategies you know of to make sure that we're hiring based on talent and skill, or choosing entrepreneurs based on ability rather than on glitz. And one of my favorite stories is the fact that there was research done that showed that psychopaths do really, really well in interviews because they can be whatever they think someone wants them to be, not necessarily your preferred employees. So Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about how we can make sure that we do identify and reward talent?
Yeah, that's really interesting about the psychopaths, and similarly for actors, right? they can really perform in any role. Yeah, so we as people developing talent, I think what's really important, rather than looking at the obvious candidates for roles, we should look at individual contributions and take that personality traits into consideration. I think that's more important, along with the skills and abilities, but it's more, the core values that person brings to the table, which is so important and underrated a lot of times, because we're looking at tangible or measurable kind of KPIs, and then the softer skills and softer attributes are not really recognized or rated as high. So I think consciously when looking for talent is to develop strategies or questions to really seek out our personal traits, because they say, a spotted leopard can't change its spots. And so, trying to bring out examples or problem solving examples and see how that person would respond. And whether it's a male or female, female do take a much more collaborative approach to problem solving. They do look more to the future. They're more emotional in their decision making, and these are all valuable attributes to have in any team. So that's what I think.
That's really important. Others, Marianne, did you want to jump in here and talk about some of the strategies you think are important for identifying and supporting high potential talent?
Recognizing that, this is an individual, and also making sure you don't have any of that unconscious bias that comes into play when you're interviewing. So essentially looking, what is the position that I'm hiring for, but making sure that you have good hiring practices and interview practices, and making sure that people who are interviewing at the early stage are aware of what their own biases are, and that doesn't come into play at the interview. So, if it was a blind interview, for example, does this person meet the technical side of the skill set I'm looking for, but also what is the personal traits that come into play here that could really grow beyond the specific role, right? So I always look for not just what I'm hiring for specifically at that time, but how does this person develop within our organization and beyond, right? So I get to know the person more in terms of what they bring to the table. So apart from the technical tests that we can give individuals, you also want to make sure that the recruiting is done in a broader group. So it's not just one person interviewing. And I lean also on, you know, my HR partners for their guidance in terms of what is the talent strategy that we have to meet our business plan here, because you have to engage, you know, your human resource partners in that discussion, and you learn so much from, you know, my own bias that I might bring to the table. So making sure that's at bay and you're really interviewing the person for who they are and what they will bring to the organization holistically.
Thanks so much. I have, I know that I need to hand it back to Sabine because we've got lots of questions from the audience, but I had one last question because it's very much on my mind these days. And that is, when you think about the impacts of COVID from where you sit, do you see impacts that are different for women and particularly for immigrant women? And what are the implications of those differences for government programs? Maybe you can start, Lisa, given that you're an entrepreneur. Have you seen any specific issues in terms of accessing support for your business?
Yeah, so the government has introduced some initiatives to help, you know, all businesses. So I think that that's a great step. It doesn't, you know, differentiate or discriminate against gender, so that's good. But I, as women and, you know, immigrant women as well, like just the workload has actually increased, you know, with the kids being home and trying to manage the online schooling and becoming an IT expert and trying to fulfill your own role as well, and juggling lunch and dinner. And there's a lot more now that has just come to the table that us as women just naturally get up, embrace, and get on with it, which is very, very different to the men who are normally, you know, just get out the door and go to work, you know, to have to kind of get involved in that. So having a supportive partner or a support network around is very helpful, and to offer and receive, I think it's creating a much more community approach to tackling these unprecedented times in history. So that's where I see. In terms of my business, we took the initiative to help the public become more compliant and develop masks that we've now made available so that staff can go to work and feel protected, that my food production is not being impacted, and that retailers are getting their deliveries. So just thinking outside the box is not unheard of. I think sometimes we fear to kind of get creative and take a plunge outside our normal environment and situation. And what I can say is, actually, you get that idea, you think you can be creative, just go for it. This is the time to really flourish. And a lot of businesses have started in financial crisis, like Uber, WhatsApp, and Airbnb all started and emerged from, you know, times in the economy when it was down. So don't let the environment affect your ambition for what you can achieve as an individual.
Necessity is the mother of invention, and I think you're quite right that while we're seeing lots of businesses suffer terribly as a result of COVID, we're also seeing it drive innovation and accelerate change in ways we never expected. You know, universities and hospitals have resisted e-learning and e-health for decades, and suddenly they were transformed overnight. So I think that's a good point. Sabine, back to you. I know there are lots of questions from the audience.
Yes, and lots of good ones. So I'm quickly trying to see what are the ones we definitely want to address. There were some very specific questions for some of the panelists, and I thought I'd start with those and then move on to some more generic ones that anybody could answer. This was a question for you, Lisa. And the question was, why would you say mentioning that you have kids and a family was your first mistake when trying to find investors? Are you saying that we as women should pretend like this isn't our truth?
I know it's a dilemma, you know, and it's kind of hit the heart and the guts at the same time when I had to change my story. It was only after so many times. Like, this is the thing, like, so many meetings, so many responses. When you start to see a pattern, then sometimes you have to take a step back and recognize what is the real issue here. How can I change my story to get a better response? And it was advised by a man, surprisingly, that this could be one of the tactics to use, and surprisingly, it did work. So that's the only reason why. It's not like I really wanted to do so anyway, because I think I have a great story to tell about that.
Thank you. Wendy, did you want to comment on that as well? On Lisa's response, or good to go? Oh, you're muted, Wendy. Sorry. Okay.
No, good.
Okay. All right. The next question, and there are a number of questions or variations of it. And the question is, what do I do, or how can I, as an individual, help my employer to recognize my talent and my potential?
I think I'll take that one.
Yes, Marianne.
I think, well, from my own experience, I have taken the initiative to speak directly to my own manager to say, this is what this is my success. Here's my track record. You know, I've implemented a global client analytics solution once. I've repeated that success. So it wasn't just that I was lucky and a fluke. I truly have what it takes technically. I understand the business, but above and beyond that, here's what I bring to the table in terms of negotiating, influencing, you know, collaboration. And as women, what I believe we do extremely well is we really have the ability to bring diverse personalities and skill sets and, you know, to the table together at the same time. I mean, I look at what's being done by Women in Capital Markets with the Return to Bay Street program. That is bringing the, you know, competitive financial institutions together to tap into a women talent pool that has left the workforce for whatever reason. But they recognize this is high caliber professional women that we should support and engage and bring back into our industry. So, you know, that speaks to how successful women are in advocating for other women and for advocating for that talent. And so you should not hesitate to, you know, to go forward and say, this is what I have to offer. And you might be bored of your job. If you are, it doesn't hurt to say, you know, I really don't feel I can do this anymore because here's what I could do better, right? So that happened to me as well, where I, you know, was ready to resign, spoke to my manager, and the next thing he said was, I had no idea you didn't like your job. And it took me a year to, you know, to say that, because I thought, oh, you know, it's not a good thing for me to say that I really don't like my job. But I didn't just say I don't want to do this anymore. I said, here's what I believe I can do, and here's the added value. So you should really have a good business case when you go forward and demonstrate why it is you should strive for more and for, you know, a bigger role and for a stretch assignment.
Thank you, Marianne. And I think there's a number of follow-up questions to this. And the question is, how do I build confidence? Because as a woman, that's, I think, the area that is my biggest gap, and variations of this question from a number of people. Nadine or Lisa, anybody who would like to take that?
I can start just really quickly. Developing confidence doesn't come overnight. You know, it takes time. And I think, you know, try to find some role models that you feel that, oh, I would like to have that kind of confidence, and just watch their behaviors and how they interact with other people. How do they, you know, have a voice and be heard? How are they communicating? Not only to, you know, their management, but also their peers. And another tactic to help you have confidence, but also have a voice in showcasing what you can do and your abilities, is to let your peers know. So the more of you that talk about how amazing you are, it actually helps a lot, you know. So you're not the only one that you feel that, oh, I'm just boasting about myself. And as women, we tend to feel that that's a bit too much, and men just casually just get up and do it, you know. So if you have other people that can join you and commend you on what you have achieved, that gives you a boost of confidence, but also more of a voice and a much more stronger voice to be heard with.
Thank you, Lisa. Did anybody else want to add to it? Yes, Nadine.
I wanted to say it's like a muscle. You have to, if you flex the, you work the muscle, you'll develop it. And so you want to, at every chance you get, assert yourself, put yourself forward, and speak up and practice. And, you know, going back to TV shows, because I've been watching a lot of them, you know, Grey's Anatomy, where she stands up, the doctor in the room, and she does her superhero pose, she stands up. So whatever it is that works for you to give you that breath of confidence to you know, to move from where you are to go forward, I think you do that. But the more we do it, is the better we get at it.
Can I add one? Can I jump in and add
Yes.
one point?
Yeah.
Because I do think that one of the things, and this relates both to leaders as well as to aspiring leaders, is feedback is so critical. And I see so many cases where no one has, you know, someone does an MBA and then a master's degree in something else, and then they're frustrated because they're not getting a job. And no one has sat them down and talked to them about their communication skills or their communication style or the way that they present themselves. Feedback is critical, and as managers, it's critical to provide the feedback in ways that people will hear, but also as ambitious women, it's important that we seek out the feedback and are prepared to take it back. And so when we look at things like confidence, self-presentation is so absolutely, absolutely fundamental. If we're not getting feedback on how people see us, we're not going to get better.
Yeah, and Sabina, I want to add one more thing. I actually had a real wake-up call early in my career because I tend to be very results-oriented, and I actually, you know, was losing collaboration from people I needed to work with. And it was really my manager, thankfully, who pulled me aside and said, "You're not going to achieve your objectives because, you know, people don't want to work with you." And I couldn't understand it. I was like, "What do you mean?" And then I said, "You know, but I'm doing this because you asked me to meet these objectives. So what do you mean?" And, you know, fortunately, he sent me for executive leadership coaching, where I became very self-aware. And, you know, that helped me a lot because I think that feedback was very important because I didn't accept it at first. I was in denial. But then today, it has made me a much better person in terms of how I communicate and how I, you know, listen more and how I, you know, speak out opinions. And I think even on LinkedIn, just doing the recommendations was great for me because I worked for 18 years. I was out of the workforce for 5. And I lost touch with a lot of my contacts. So I said, "Could you please give me a recommendation?" And they wrote, like, I had this 360, you know, feedback from people. And I was like, "Oh my God, they remembered what I did 20 years ago. And this is what they really, you know, thought about me. Like, that's incredible." And I got some, and here's where you could really look at improving too. So, you know, so it's great when people are comfortable enough to even give you that candid feedback, and how you respond to it is very important too.
Well, I also think that you had the courage to listen to what they had to say. So I think that's just equally important. There's one more question that I really would like to take. And this is from somebody who has asked, do you have any suggestions for ways that we as managers can be inclusive to the softer or more introverted voices at the table? How do we translate this to an online learning environment in light of COVID-19? Did anybody want to take that? Maybe start with the first part, to be inclusive to the softer and more introverted voices.
I always ask people questions on calls if I haven't heard them speak. So, you know, I call them out very gently and always say, you know, haven't heard, you know, what your thoughts are. It would be great to know. And you need to look out for that even in a conference room and in a meeting. When, you know, look for body language. We don't have as much of it unless you're doing a Zoom call, but essentially I look for the non-verbal communication, and 75% of that, I believe, or more is, you know, communication is non-verbal. So look for the, change in expression or body language, and if you're on a call, solicit their opinion.
Excellent, thank you. I am very mindful of time. We are at 1:30, so maybe it is time to wrap up. I wanted to take this moment to say thank you to everybody. I mean, this was such an insightful afternoon, and I could keep listening to all of you and ask so many more questions. What I've learned from you today, Wendy, is to not staying stuck in the weeds and focusing on doing a good job, but to instead to look at what's coming next. And from Marianne, I loved what you said. You know, the difference between high performers and high potentials is that as a high potential, you work to understand what your organization wants and to look at it holistically and to make sure that you're engaging with different domains so that you have the biggest impact. And from Nadeem, I love that you are a big fan of, you know, now I've forgotten the name, the Shark Tank. Shark Tank, thank you. But to be aware that there are individuals on your team who may not be comfortable with communicating their value. And I think that is so important because sometimes we just focus on the squeaky wheels and tend to ignore the ones that who are not speaking up. Lisa, there was so much that you had to share, but what I think I loved the best was when you said the courage to walk away when you have to, because if you're being called to prove over and over again that you are not a risky investment. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for being here today. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to make a special shout out to the organizing committee, to Brooke, Erica and Andrea from Ryerson, and Dota and Amber from One Oak Events for managing all the back end and ensuring that all the various pieces tied up beautifully together today. And a special thanks to Linda and Valerie and our super organizer, Jennifer Dubois from Rotman, for keeping us all together and on track. And to the audience, thank you all for your interest in the webinar topic and submitting some really great questions. We're sorry I couldn't get to all of them today, but we hope you found the conversation informative and beneficial. So for more information on similar topics, stay tuned and follow the Diversity Institute at Ryerson and the Intercultural Skills Lab at Rotman. Our social media handles are now posted in the QA box, so do make sure that you follow us and stay tuned for more to come. Thank you all for joining us today, and keep well, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks, Sabrina.
Thank you.